Good evening. We are so grateful to have all of you here, and I welcome you on behalf of the Landiss Lecture Series. We hope that you will, if you're new and if this is your first one, that you'll come back for the next one. We're always delighted to have you experience these with us. We always pause here to remember with gratitude that this series was begun, endowed by the late Dr. Morris Landiss, who endowed it just a few short months before his death. And Mrs. Landiss continued the commitment all of her life, and we miss her yet, Shipley. And we're grateful that Shipley and Leslie have all through the years continued their steadfast encouragement and interest in this program. I'm just enthralled with this book that Frye's going to be talking about tonight. It spoke to me from the beginning. I know a title can sell a book, and the minute I read the title, before I even knew any more about it, I was hooked. That's because I'm a reader. I've always been a reader. My father was a reader, and he encouraged me and mentored me in that regard and gave me gifts that I will always be grateful for. We were reminiscing at the dinner table over our reading habits and the bookstores and the libraries. And I always have a favorite reminiscent when I think about this, because I grew up in a small town in southern Kentucky, and we had a good library, a school library and a public library. My siblings and I walked from the ends of the town to converge on my dad's office, which was in the center of the little town, and he would take us home. And I always held up the gang because I stopped at the library on my way. My father was head of the school system and chairman of the library board. And one day, our kind librarian called him and told him that she didn't mean to be nosy and she just wanted to do her job well. But Carolyn was reading everything in the library. Did he really want me to do that? And his answer was, I'm sure, not what she expected. But he said, of course, only a good reader will be formed by reading a lot. And that's one of the many great gifts that he gave me. And it seemed a good time to share that. Frye tells us he began his reading at a young age, reading about the Revolutionary War. I think that's a good way to start, Frye. And the history is always appealing. I love mythology. I wore out Edith Hamilton over and over and over again as a child, and still have a great interest in mythology. When asked whether he liked books, Mark Twain said he liked a thin book because it could steady a table, a leather volume because it could strop a razor, and a heavy book because you could throw it at a cat. Did I quote that right, Denny? Books are meaningful to each of us in different ways, and we like them for different reasons. This memoir of reading that Frye Gallard has penned for us is rich in tribute to so many books of so many different kinds, and it stirs your own remembrances and recollections. And as I went through it, I passed through quickly the things I had read, though I was interested in seeing what he had to say about them. And the second time I started reading and went through it, I had to go back and make a list of all the things I hadn't read because I thought probably I need to get busy on these. It's a rich, enjoyable book, and you're going to be greatly benefited from hearing him talk about this. He's written a great many other books, quite a lot, written social history, a great deal on the civil rights movement. He is both author and journalist. Many of these have gained notable awards, even been nominated for an Emmy. I didn't know that. He is currently writer-in-residence at the University of South Alabama, and we are honored to add him to our list of distinguished speakers on this series. It's going to be a lot of fun to explore his literary memoirs and bring back our own. So please join me in welcoming to the Landiss Lecture Series, Frye Gallard.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's great to be here at David Lipscomb. Nashville is coming home for me. I went to college at another little school here, and that's now become a football factory. I don't know if y'all are aware. Vanderbilt's prowess these days, but I'm not the least bit embarrassed by it, I want to say. Don't feel that my degree is diminished at all by the fact that James Franklin is now the coach, so good for him. I'm really honored also to be at the Landiss lecture series because so many of my literary friends and heroes have already been here. Lee Smith, John Edgerton, Will Campbell, Clyde Edgerton. A lot of people who actually I've written about in this book have spoken at this series, and thank you to your family for making it possible and many happy returns. I think it'll keep it going. I'm going to talk about The Books That Mattered, a reader's memoir. And it's a book about how reading for me became something that not only enriched, but at times actually altered my life. And it was an irony in some ways because I didn't like books when I was a little kid. When I was very small, it seemed to me that books were either dull or terrifying. Either it was See-Spot Run and those kind of dreadful things that they gave us to try to teach us to read when we were in elementary school, or it was these, to me, terrifying fairy tales of witches and tigers and giants and all these malevolent creatures trying to eat little kids about my own age. And it just seemed to me, I was so literal-minded that I just thought, well, this is terrible. I mean, I don't want to read about, a witch that they have to burn alive to stay alive and all this kind of stuff. So I didn't read much as a little kid. I love stories, though. I came of age in a family of storytellers. My grandfather died when he was 103. He was born in 1856 and died in 1959. And so he had lived through everything from the Civil War to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement and had accumulated incredible stories about how things change and about things that mattered to him. And I just loved to sit and listen to him tell stories about things that he had seen along the way. And I thought stories were wonderful, and I didn't make the connection until I was in the 4th grade between stories and books. That sounds really strange, I know, but I thought, books were over here, not to be messed with, and stories were to be enjoyed as somebody told them to you one-on-one. And then I came upon Johnny Tremain, a book about the Revolutionary War, in which the protagonist was only a little bit older than I was when I read the book. And it was a book that was written, it turned out, by Esther Forbes, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. The year before Johnny Tremain came out, she had won the Pulitzer Prize for a biography that she had written about Paul Revere, and so she had this ability to make a time and place come alive in a way that I just didn't realize happened in books. And so I was pretty hooked from that point on. But I think the first book for me that really had a major impact on my life and began to become part of a process in which books kind of created their own reality, their own life-enriching reality, because one book would make me think later of another book, which would make me think of something that had happened to me in my own life, which might make me think of a song I'd heard on the radio or whatever it might be, but all of a sudden this reality was created that made life richer than it had been before, I think. And the first book that really began to do that for me was Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And again, I was probably 14 the first time I read that book. And I started reading it because it was a cool story of adventure. It was a boy about my own age. In fact, I think Huck was 14 at the time that the story takes place. And he has embarked upon this incredible adventure that it seemed to me that any kid 14 years old in his right mind would want to do. I mean, floating down the Mississippi River on a raft, and then in the company of a runaway slave and all the adventures that produced, it just seemed like this marvelous story of adventure and just an exhilarating thing to kind of be a part of vicariously. But I think that was maybe the first book that I also started appreciating on a second level. I couldn't have told you why when I was 14 years old, but there was something about the language and the way Mark Twain used it. One of his biographers later talked about Twain's prodigious ability to notice, to just kind of look at ordinary things and see them in an extraordinary way and put it into language that would be poetic and that would engage the ear as well as the eye and the other senses. And so he would write passages like this paragraph, coming out of the mouth of a 14-year-old boy who is illiterate, right, in the story. I felt so lonesome I most wished I was dead. The stars were shining and the leaves rustled in the woods, ever so mournful, and I heard an owl away off hoo-hooing about somebody that was dead, and a whippoorwill and a dog crying about somebody that was going to die, and the wind was trying to whisper something to me, and I couldn't make out what it was, and so it made the cold shivers run over me. Then away out in the woods, I heard that kind of sound that a ghost makes when it wants to tell something that's on its mind and can't make itself understood, and so can't rest easy in its grave, and has to go about that way every night grieving. I got so downhearted and scared, I did wish I had some company. There was something so poetic about that language and the way it kind of poured out and the way it developed character and gave you a sense of place. And all of it was sort of plausibly in the knowledge out of the mouth and within the knowledge framework of a kid who didn't know how to read. And yet, here was this amazing poetry that Mark Twain had so convincingly put into the mind of this 14-year-old boy. But that wasn't the only thing that he put there. He also put there a kind of serious wrestling with the greatest moral dilemma probably that this country has ever faced. Really, I think the great original sin of America. And that was the issue of slavery, the issue of race that has echoed throughout our history, an issue that the founding fathers finessed because they thought to deal with it would be to tear the country apart before it even got started. And so you had this boy, Huck Finn, who has been raised on all the assumptions that he grew up with, the assumption that white people are better than black people, that slavery is the natural order of things, that really it's just ordained, it's the way God intended it, that white people should own slaves. He believes all this. But then he winds up on a raft floating down the Mississippi River with a runaway slave. And he thinks to himself, I'm helping this guy run away. And God, being white himself, is going to look down and probably send me to hell for doing this. But he's so caught up eventually in the humanity of Jim, the runaway slave. And they form this unlikely friendship across this artificial intellectual divide that has been kind of imposed upon him by the culture. And so this awareness of their common humanity becomes so powerful for Huck that he says, well, I guess I'll just go to hell then. And it's one of the great iconic scenes in American literature, I think. It's probably the scene that caused Ernest Hemingway to say that all American literature, all great writing in America, stems from Huckleberry Finn. It's a satirical and yet also tender and warm-hearted account of a young boy confronting the major problem, really, that confronted the whole country, and realizing how simple the solution was, really, and that was just to understand and respect each other's humanity. And I think that I didn't grasp all of this the first time through, and yet it nibbled away, I think, at the back of my mind. And that nibbling became stronger as I read other books that dealt with some of these same ideas. A year after reading Huck Finn, I read To Kill a Mockingbird. Again, I was drawn to it because the characters were about my age. Jim and Scout in their summertime adventures of trying to make Boo Radley come out. You know, this scary guy who they didn't really know, they'd never seen, and yet they'd heard all these stories about him, and they, as kids will do, were trying to goad him and get him to come out so they could see him and enjoy the thrill of being terrified of this guy up close and personal. And I loved that piece of the story. But I think the same thing began to happen for me, and that was that I also, at least on some level, was aware of the brilliance of Harper Lee's telling of the story. Later, if you go back and look at it, and I've read that book a number of times, it's almost like she has somehow, and I still don't quite understand how, but she has created this dual narrator almost. I mean, the story is narrated by Scout Finch, who at the time the story takes place is 8 years old. And so sometimes the narrating voice sounds like an 8-year-old child with all the innocence and kind of wonder and hard-headedness that an 8-year-old can contain. But there's also the sense of an old lady looking back wisely over things that happened when she was young. And you get this sense of both characters that are really the same character at different times in the life, sometimes in the same paragraph of the story. I mean, go back and read that book and you'll see really how remarkable the voice is in which Harper Lee has told that story. And then, in addition to that, again, it deals with this same great overarching moral issue that still confronted the country. That book came out in 1960. That was the year of the first sit-ins, which student sit-ins at lunch counters, which ratcheted up the intensity of the civil rights movement to a point where it really wasn't clear to a lot of us in the South that we would make it through these times. I mean, it seemed so hard. The issue seemed so hard, even though we look back now and it seems so simple. But it was so intense that nobody was quite sure what to do next, and nobody was quite sure, even if segregation was wrong, how do we create some kind of different reality, and can we even do that, and can we make it from here to there in the way that we obviously need to do? And here was Harper Lee giving us this book with the character Atticus Finch. Atticus Finch, the father of Jim and Scout, who, not because he wants to, but because he's asked to and feels a sense of duty, takes on the case of a black man who's falsely accused of rape. And essentially, he just does the right thing. You know, he tries his best to give this man the defense that he deserves, give him the day in court that he deserves, confident that his innocence will be revealed. And the interesting thing about the Atticus Finch character, I think, for a lot of us was he just seemed so familiar, you know? He was so Southern. Most of us had grown up knowing somebody who had some of the archetypical characteristics of Atticus Finch. And so here was a guy who was recognizably Southern, who just did the right thing in a way that kind of made you think, well, you know, if everybody did this, then we could do this. We could handle this kind of situation in which we find ourselves. It prompted those kind of thoughts, even if they were vague and not fully articulated. And so there was a great comfort for me in reading To Kill a Mockingbird in that kind of context. But I think also sometimes books give us the gift of discomfort. And I want to mention one more that deals with this same theme that was important to me. I got to Vanderbilt as a freshman in 1964, and it was the year the first class of black undergraduates arrived at Vanderbilt. And as you might imagine, these were just extraordinary young people. And I got to the campus not really believing it anymore, and yet having been raised with the assumption that I was supposed to be better than them. I was white and they were not, and that made me better. I had been, everybody that I knew up to that point in my life who was white believed that in one form or another. And I had begun to doubt it because of books I had read, but yet it was still, I wasn't sure, and I was wrestling with all this. And here I come to Vanderbilt, and there are these amazing kids who happen to be African American. I remember my first semester at Vanderbilt, I was fervently praying for a D in calculus, which I never earned, but I did pass because I went to the professor, and I think I had a 58 with 60 being passing, and I was kind of begging, but the argument I used was, if you pass me, you won't have to teach me again, you know. And this was very persuasive to him, and so I got my D in calculus. But the kid down the hall, who was African American, was making an A in calculus without any kind of begging being involved. And so it was clear to me that this had been a big lie on which I was raised, that I was supposed to be better, that skin color had anything to do one way or the other with people being better or worse than each other. Very basic stuff now, but at the time it was still in the category of a revelation. And I remember it set me off into a lot of reading, and I began to read books on the other side of the great divide, the great racial divide. And one of the ones that I found most disturbing when I read it for the first time in college was a book by Richard Wright called Uncle Tom's Children. Not one of Richard Wright's most famous books, Black Boy or Native Son, which were much better known. Uncle Tom's Children, not to be confused with Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a collection of short stories. It was the first book that this African-American writer from Mississippi originally had ever done. He had written under the influence of his readings of H.L. Mencken, a crusading journalist who liked to say that he used words as weapons to try to get people to examine things more deeply. And Richard Wright wanted in this book to use words as weapons, and he did. And it was one of the most, in some ways, brutal and disturbing books that I have ever read to this day. The first short story, very long short story, almost a novella, is called Big Boy Leaves Home. And it's about these 4 African-American kids who are in this swimming hole one day that's on a white man's property, and they're skinny dipping, and one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden people are killed, and a lynch mob is searching for the 2 surviving black kids who were swimming in this swimming hole. It's such a brutal story that even other black writers, Zora Neale Hurston, said that this was a story with no redeeming value at all, that it had no humanity in it, no redemption in it, and was disturbing to the point that it shouldn't even be read by people. And yet, for me, it was like, yeah, but I bet it was sort of like this back in those days. And so it was profoundly disconcerting. There was another story, another novella in that book called Bright and Morning Star. I want to read you a paragraph or two from Richard Wright, kind of strung together by my own observations. But it was about an old woman who had grown sons who in the 1930s had joined the Communist Party not because they were Marxists, but because they thought that there was nobody else that really cared about the plight of black people and poor people in the South. And so they had joined this party, and their mother, this old woman named Sue, who's the protagonist, is disturbed by this because she had been a devout Christian all her life. And so this is Sue, Richard Wright entering the mind of his character Sue. Long hours of scrubbing floors for a few cents a day had taught her who Jesus was. What a great boon it was to cling to him, to be like him, and suffer without a mumbling word. She had poured the yearning of her life into songs, feeling buoyed with a faith beyond this world. The figure of the man nailed in agony to the cross, his burial in a cold grave, his transfigured resurrection, his being breath and clay, God and man, all had focused her feelings upon an imagery which had swept her life into a wondrous vision. But against that faith and her love of old hymns loomed the terrible reality of the world. And she had 2 sons who were ready to fight, ready to struggle in the here and now for justice that lay in a different kind of vision. Lacking other allies, her boys had joined the Communist Party, a decision more common in the 1930s than many people remember. and they dreamed of a day when poor whites and blacks would come together against a common foe. Slowly, inevitably, the dream had become their mother's as well, and she was astonished at the way it made her feel. Richard Wright's words again. And day by day, her sons had ripped from her startled eyes her old visions, and image by image had given her a new one, different but great and strong enough to fling her into the light of another grace. The wrongs and suffering of black men had taken the place of him nailed to the cross. The meager beginnings of the party had become another resurrection, and the hate of those who would destroy her new faith had quickened in her a hunger to feel how deeply her new strength went. You know, I realized as I was reading that there was not only a book about social justice, but it was also a book about what William Faulkner said all good writing is about, and that is the human heart in conflict with itself. And that was one of the things that great novelists did. It wasn't just that they kind of created a moral and a sort of didactic preaching that they aimed at us. It was that they wrapped it in these stories with all these layers of meaning and depth, and that got to the heart of the human condition, which has to do with the human heart itself. And so that awareness of what writing could be, I think, grew during these same years of reading books that I was initially drawn to by either the characters or later the subject matter or whatever it might be. Now, I will say that I came to a point where reading was not always so heavy, you know, that I wasn't always reading books that made me want to slit my wrists or, you know, tear my hair out or even go down and join a protest march. One of the books that I write about in here in a chapter called Just Telling a Story was written by my friend Clyde Edgerton, and it's a book called Walking Across Egypt. And Clyde is one of those, if you saw him here, I don't know how many of you did, but if you saw him, what you know about Clyde is that he is that rarest of literary creatures. He's a happy writer, right? I mean, he's a person who grew up in a functional family. I mean, they actually exist, apparently. And he was an only child. He loved his parents. He loved his extended family of cousins and aunts and uncles and so forth. And he had a view that life was good, basically. And yet he had this wonderful, ironic sense of humor. And he decided to write the book Walking Across Egypt when his mother, who he loved very much, was about 80 years old and told him the story of how she had had her favorite chair reupholstered. And this is the true thing that generated this novel, and she had taken the bottom out of the chair send it off to be reupholstered. And while the bottom was out of the chair, she was getting ready to watch TV, and she went backward toward the chair and sat down in it. And as she told the story to Clyde, she just kept going, you know, just going, until finally she was stuck. Her hands and her feet were both pointed up, and she couldn't get out of the chair. And she told Clyde this story and was laughing so hard that he said, I have to write a novel that I create around a character that does what my mother did here. And so he did. And that scene kind of opens the novel, and it is just, if you're not laughing aloud to the point almost of crying as you read it, then I don't know what to say. It is an incredibly funny scene, but he also builds this character whose name is Maddie Rigsby, an elderly woman in a small southern town who wishes for grandchildren, and her 2 children, grown children, have not yet obliged, much to her consternation. And so she fills up her life by going to church and doing volunteer things and this kind of thing that women her age do in small towns. And she begins reading the Bible a little more seriously maybe than she had read it before, and she becomes fascinated by this passage that says, "Inasmuch as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me." And she thinks, now, that's pretty interesting. I wonder who the least of these are. And she thinks that she lives not far from this youth prison, this home for juvenile delinquents. And she thinks to herself, well, they might be the least of these. And so she begins to visit this kid in the juvenile detention center. And the kid has no idea why this woman suddenly starts showing up, this old woman, bringing him pies and cookies and all this kind of stuff. And the only thing he can come up with is that it must be his grandmother. And the only thing that the people in her church can come up with was that Maddie Rigsby had lost her mind. And so it's this book that kind of plays out hilariously but also poignantly against that backdrop. It never made me feel bad. It made me feel good. And yet, even though it was kind of an act of escape to read it, it was also, there was a kind of humanity about the book that always has stayed with me. Another book that I wrote about in a similar way was called The Old Man and Lesser Mortals. It was a nonfiction book. It was a collection of journalistic pieces by a guy named Larry L. King, not to be confused with Larry King, the CNN guy that did all the interviews with people. Larry L. King was a great magazine writer, one of the best that I ever read. And he wrote this piece about his father. His father was a Texas dirt farmer. And Larry grew up wanting to be anything but that, and went away to New York and became a successful writer. And the gap between them just grew enormous because it seemed like they had nothing in common. And so he wrote this piece about the rediscovery across the generations of what generations can have in common. And if I can find it, I will read you just the first paragraph of it because it just was so, I thought, so lovely. While we digested our suppers on the old man's front porch, his grandchildren chased fireflies in the summer dusk, and in turn were playfully chased by neighborhood dogs. As always, the old man had carefully locked the collar on his workday khakis. He recalled favored horses and mules from his farming days, remembering their names and personalities, though they had been 30 or 40 years dead. I gave him a brief thumbnail sketch of William Faulkner, Mississippian, great writer, appreciator of the soil and good bourbon, before quoting what Faulkner had written of the mule. He will draw a wagon or a plow, but he will not run a race. He will not try to jump anything he does not indubitably know beforehand he can jump. He will not enter into any place unless he knows of his own knowledge what is on the other side. He will work for you patiently for 10 years for the chance to kick you once. The old man cackled in delight. That Faulkner feller sure knowed his mules, he said. It was just, as I say, a lovely, poignant piece about people reaching out across the generations and trying to get to know each other again. And for me, it inspired me as a writer with the sense of the literary possibilities of nonfiction, that you could use all of the devices as a nonfiction writer that were available to the novelist and others. And yet, for me as a reader, it was always fiction, I think, that propelled me and that moved me the most. And I want to talk about two more books before I close that were very important to me in that regard. One of them is All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, my favorite book that I've ever read. I will say that not everybody agrees with that. My wife, Nancy, who is wrong about almost nothing, is wrong about All the King's Men. She doesn't like it, can't get into it, and we've had this discussion many times. And it's one of the few times that I've said, no, you just have to understand, I'm right this time, you're not. But it's a book written by, of course it has, Robert Penn Warren, the author, has Nashville connections, Vanderbilt connections. And he left Vanderbilt and he went to LSU, where he became a professor back in the 1930s when Huey Long was the leading figure in Louisiana politics. Now, I don't know how many of you remember much about Huey Long. I actually, I had to go and reread his story because it's so really kind of amazing. I think I had a sense of him as another in a long line of Southern political demagogues, right? We've had quite a few. And certainly there was that aspect to Huey Long, but he was this incredible rarity. He was a left-wing Southern demagogue. right, in the 1930s. He was a guy who believed that the problem in this country was inequality of wealth. And that he believed it so strongly, in fact, that he, during a period of time when he served simultaneously as governor and U.S. senator from Louisiana at the same time, right? He proposed a program called Share Our Wealth that he thought went way beyond what he regarded as Franklin Roosevelt's anemic New Deal policies. And he said what should happen in the country is that for every penny that a person makes over $1 million a year, that's still a lot of money, it was in the 1930s, but for every penny that somebody makes over $1 million a year, the government should simply take it and give it to poor people. Give it to poor people to build houses, give it to them if they're veterans to have jobs and better health care. I mean, he had a long list of things you could do with this money. And for every cent that anybody claims in their net worth over $8 million, you just take that too and give it to poor people. And the government becomes this force that tries to level the playing field in America in this really profound and kind of radical way. It's sort of amazing to hear that an elected official actually proposed such a thing, right? Particularly in these times when government policy is the opposite. When from tax policies to corporate welfare to corporate bailouts, whatever it may be, the government is a factor in the fact that inequality of wealth is becoming more dramatic in this country than it's ever been in the past. But here was this figure in the 1930s that was trying to do the opposite, and a kind of amazing thing, and Robert Penn Warren found this fascinating. But juxtaposed with the fact that Huey Long was power crazy. He was corrupt, he was megalomaniacal to such an extent that not only did he hold the office of U.S. Senate and governor of Louisiana at the same time, but he loved LSU football and would go to the games and sit on the bench, and the coaches knew they had to call whatever play Huey thought they ought to call. So Robert Penn Warren is fascinated by this guy and turns him into the character Willie Stark in All the King's Men, and yet Willie Stark, as majestic and flawed and horrifying and grand as he is not the major character in this book. It's the narrator of the story, Jack Burden. And so there's just all these layers of complex storytelling written in poetry, almost, prose that's almost poetry. Robert Penn Warren won the Pulitzer Prize 3 times, once for All the King's Men and twice for books of poetry. He was a poet first, and his novel reads like it. And so I find myself just reading it again and again and again just for the beauty of the language. Now, all of these books that I've talked about have tended up to now to be books that I read when I was younger. But the good news is that great books still keep coming, you know. One of my favorites in recent years, one that I refer to in here as maybe the first classic of the 21st century, is a book called Habs Wife, written by Sina Jeter Naslund, who is a native of Birmingham, now runs the MFA program at Spalding University in Louisville. And Sina Naslund wrote this book after she made a cross-country trip with her daughter, who was then 13. And they listened to books on tape as they drove from the East Coast to the West Coast. And Sina thought her 13-year-old daughter would love Little Women and some others that Sina had loved when she was that age, and her daughter did. But the book she loved the most was Moby Dick. And Sina was astonished by this, and proud too, because here was this, magnificently vast American novel written by Herman Melville, creating this character of Ahab and his quest for revenge against the white whale. And here was her 13-year-old daughter that was fascinated by this story and the language that Melville had used to tell it. And the only thing that made Sina Naslund sad about this was that there were no women characters to amount to anything in Moby Dick. And she had just enough feminist juices stirring in her that she didn't like this. And then she began to think about all of American literature. And she thought, where is the woman character who is as big as Ahab, let's say, or Willie Stark in All the King's Men or whatever? She thought, well, maybe it's Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, maybe. Maybe it's Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter, maybe. But she felt like even then that there was still something missing. And so she set out to create a character that would be as large as any of these male characters in the history of American literature, and I think she did it. And the book is called Ahab's Wife. And because there's one paragraph in Moby Dick that refers to Ahab as having had a wife, she takes that as license to create this character and take her through an odyssey as grand in its own way as that of Ahab himself. She also takes the character of Ahab, and being true to the way Melville drew that character, she also adds dimensions to him, and yet he's a secondary character in her book. It's a magnificent literary achievement, and the thing I loved about it was, among other things, was it became a bestseller in direct violation of all the rules of bestsellerdom, right? Because it didn't move like a John Grisham novel, like a runaway train that just, once you jump on board, you can't get off and so forth. And I'm a fan of John Grisham, but Sina wrote this book that moves in its own pace. It's over 600 pages. Once you start it, you won't want to put it down, I think, and yet you can't rush it. It won't let you. And so I just admired kind of the artistic integrity and the boldness of vision that she exhibited in writing this book, and I recommend it to you. I've since had the privilege of becoming Sina's friend. I've gotten to know her, and she's as fine a person as she is a writer, but this is just a wonderful book, published in either 1999 or 2000, but it received its acclaim in the current millennium, and I think really deserves it. The last thing I'm going to do before I open it up for questions, I'm going to tell you about, she wrote another book soon afterwards called Four Spirits. She grew up in Birmingham, and she was there at the time of the Birmingham church bombing, and always in 1963, and always thought she wanted to write about it. And so she wrote this novel in which that event happens, but everything is kind of wrapped around it. And I remember thinking, even as much as I admired her, when I heard that she had done this, that it was just not something a novelist could handle because the literal nonfiction story was so powerful in and of itself. And so I'm going to read in closing just a bit of reflection on Sina Naslin attempting to write a novel about something that I already thought was so powerful. I end this passage skeptically about her ability to do it. I have to say that in the next passage, I talk about how she did it, in fact. I had recently been to Birmingham and interviewed the Reverend John Cross, minister of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the target of the Sunday morning bomb. It was a day, Cross said, that began with such promise, September 15th, 1963, full of bright sunshine and the singing of birds, a morning when the older children in the church would serve as ushers and sing in the choir at the main church service. But at 10:29, the bomb exploded. When Cross first felt the building shake, he thought momentarily of the water heater. They had been having trouble with it, and he wondered if the pipes had finally blown. But he heard people screaming and rushed outside and saw a gaping hole in the wall of the building. He quickly joined those digging through the rubble and uncovered a patent leather shoe. "That's Denise's shoe," said M.W. Pippin, a church layman who was frantically digging beside him. Pippin knew his granddaughter, Denise McNair, often wore the same kind of shoe. And almost as soon as he had spoken the words, he and Cross came upon the bodies. First Denise and then her friends, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins. As tears of rage streamed down Pippin's face, he screamed aloud what many people felt. I'd like to blow the whole town up. Then came the most astonishing part. 3 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. preached the eulogy for the children, and this is what he said. History has proven over and over again that unmerited suffering is redemptive. So in spite of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair. We must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. We must not lose faith in our white brothers. Somehow we must believe that even the most misguided among them can learn to respect the dignity and worth of all human personalities. I had always wondered how that sermon was received. How could the people in the church that day, including the shattered families of the children, possibly have listened to such noble words? On a magazine assignment a few years later, I came to Birmingham to interview Claude Wesley, father of Cynthia. Mr. Wesley was a principal in the Birmingham schools, a thin and wispy gray-haired man who wanted his students to understand black history, the taproots of freedom going back 100 years. We took our seats in his living room, and he explained that he saw the bombing that way, as a terrible, heartbreaking personal loss that was nevertheless part of a much bigger story. As he talked, he glanced at a portrait on the wall, a radiant smile on the round, pretty face. Such a beautiful girl, I said. Yes, he replied, she was a very happy child. She always liked to be in the forefront. Her teachers used to say if they could get Cynthia on their side, they could get the whole class. We talked for a while about the Birmingham movement and the changes he had seen in the city. Birmingham is now a good town, he said. It wanted to be a good town then, but there were some forces standing in the way. Finally, I came to the question I had driven all the way to Birmingham to ask. What about the eulogy? How did it feel to be called to forgiveness when bitterness and rage were the natural inclinations? Mr. Wesley's answer was quick and emphatic. We never felt bitter, he said. That would not have been fair to Cynthia. We try to deal with her memory the same way we dealt with her presence, and bitterness had no place in that. And there was something else we never did. We never said, why us? Because that would be the same thing as asking, why not somebody else? And that's a question that a Christian never asks. When I heard Claude Wesley speak those words, I thought I had never encountered a faith quite that profound, a Christian understanding that ran any deeper, and it offered such a startling contrast to the hideous act that put it to the test. The bomb that exploded in 1963 may have blown the face of Jesus from the stained glass window on the side of the church, but the hearts of the faithful had survived the wound, and in their survival had offered a redemption such as our country had rarely ever seen. So at least it seemed to me, and how could a novelist improve on that? Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'll be glad to take them. I don't want to keep you here all night, but I don't want to talk and run either if there are things. Yes, sir.
You mentioned current books that might become classic. What's on your bedside table now? What are you reading now?
One of the books that I just finished, well, I read it just in time to write about it in this book, was Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand, which is a World War II story. It's a nonfiction story. It's one that I found very powerful and moving. A novel that I read about the same time was called Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks, right? Yeah, all of a sudden I was, sorry about that, I was blanking. Geraldine Brooks wrote this story about Geraldine was a great journalist who covered troubled spots all over the world and was particularly interested in the women's stories of these in the Middle East and other Africa and other places. And on sabbatical in England, she was taking a hike through the English countryside, and she came to a historical marker that said it said Plague Village. And the marker explained that this village had been hit by bubonic plague back in 1666. And then instead of fleeing the village, as you might expect people to do, but therefore running the risk of spreading the plague, the citizens of this village, at the urging of the minister in town, had decided to remain there and ride it out. And Geraldine thought at first she was going to write a history of this. It just fascinated her that people would do this. And there wasn't quite enough historical material where she could write about it in a nonfiction way. So she took what there was and then created a novel around it. It sounds like it would be horribly grim, I know, but in fact, there's a sense of redemption in the story at the end, and it's really quite powerful. Those are some of the things that I've read recently. Everybody has their own list, you know, and that's the other thing I want to say about this. In no way am I trying to say that you guys ought to go out and buy the books that have meant the most to me, right? I mean, make your own list, think about them. But I was just trying to suggest that it's worth reflecting on what those books are in our cases and how they have become sort of intertwined with other things, other books, other experiences, events in history, whatever it might be. And so just a reminder of how rich the reading experience can actually be. Anybody else? Questions? Comments? Yes, Carolyn.
You may not want to answer this, but you know, the New York Times is doing this thing on writers on reading, and they always ask this question: what book is everybody supposed to like, and you just couldn't handle it?
Oh, interesting. You know, there have been books that I really wanted to like more than I did, and it's probably more a reflection on me than the book, I should quickly say, but like Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. It's great. It's a wonderful book with a fascinating premise set in the time of the Civil War, and I found it ultimately a really moving, important book, and yet I had real trouble getting through it. Now, this probably won't upset Charles Fraser very much, you know, to hear that Frye didn't like his book as much as some people did, you know, because he's, you know, incredibly successful writer and a great writer, so I don't want to sound like I'm bashing Charles Fraser because, you know, if anything, I'm quite envious of Charles Fraser. But he wrote a great book, but it just didn't do it for me, you know. I'm sure there are others, but, you know, that's maybe as much of my poor taste as I want to reveal at the moment. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Thanks very much. Appreciate y'all being here tonight.